Hello, and welcome back to another exciting lecture on ethical philosophy. I'm Dr. Musil, and today we're here for lecture 5 on freedom and authority. We'll be talking about John Stuart Mill and what he has to say about these ideas of freedom. How much freedom should we afford individuals? Again, this is playing off a lot of what we discussed with respect to Hobbes and Locke. And Mill is going to be very familiar with not only those two figures, but as we'll see here shortly, the entire history of philosophy that preceded him. So he's very much aware of the sorts of discussions that we've been talking about that Hobbes and Locke are having regarding the so-called state of nature. And this basic dichotomy or juxtaposition between freedom and security, or as we might say in this lecture, authority, right? Submitting to some sort of authority, all right, and agreeing not to do whatever you want, right? Moving this way on that spectrum that we've been talking about. Again, anarchy or the state of nature would be right here. And John Stuart Mill is also interested. He has a lot in this issue. He has a lot to say about not only ethics. He's one of the probably the most famous, utilitarian. So we'll talk about him in a couple lectures from now on utilitarianism. But he has a lot to say on social and political philosophy as well, as we'll see in this lecture. So he's going to have a lot to say here. As we'll see, he's going to be on board with this general notion, on board, with Hobbes and Locke, that, look, we don't want a state of anarchy. We don't want the state of nature. We need to move this way. But as we'll see, Mill is a philosophical liberal, meaning he's going to emphasize the importance or significance of retaining as many individual freedoms as possible. Granted, we can't do whatever we want. We can't retain all of our individual liberties that we might have had in a state of nature. We should only forfeit those that are absolutely necessary to garner the due degree of security that we're looking for. Okay. Hopefully that'll kind of make sense, what his reasoning is behind that, why he makes those kinds of points. That's sort of what we're going to see, his justification. That's what we'll see in this lecture. So without further ado, I thought it would behoove us to talk a little bit about John Stuart Mill himself. He's a very interesting figure. For what it's worth, one of my favorite philosophers, just because he is a good example. I always appreciate a thinker who doesn't proceed as if the opposition is completely ludicrous or crazy. John Stuart Mill, I wrote a chapter in my dissertation on Mill. So my dissertation was on the utility of religion, not the truth of religion, but on the utility of religion. How does it make us happy? How useful is it for us, and so on. Mill has a lot to say about that. I've spent a chapter on him, and the reason why I'm saying this is I also spent a chapter on someone else, Friedrich Nietzsche, who we'll be talking about later in the semester, who proceeds in a very different fashion. So whereas Nietzsche proceeds as if the opposition is completely crazy and ludicrous, Mill proceeds in a much more measured fashion, right? Look, the opposition isn't completely crazy. He will oftentimes concede whatever valid points they might have. And there's something appreciable about that, right? None of these guys are stupid. And so to me, it makes no sense to suggest, right, that any of these guys are idiots or have no idea what they're talking about. And so that's just, for what it's worth, that's something that always appealed to me about Mill. Very interesting character. Very important historically in terms of philosophy. I've already mentioned a few of the ways that he's been, very significant. Very prolific writer, as I mentioned at the bottom of slide 2. Just to give you an idea, I went out and pulled this off the shelves in my library, and this is his complete. Actually, there's one book missing. The one I worked with for my dissertation is on a different shelf over here. There's actually 8 of these, and they comprise his complete works. So pretty busy guy, right? That's a lot of writing there. And also, it's really interesting. I'm going to mention his autobiography here in a second. Much shorter. You wouldn't have to read all of this if you were interested in his autobiography. Very interesting dude, and it's interesting to hear him if you're really bored ever, or not even really bored, just bored or looking for something to do. I do highly recommend his autobiography. It's interesting to hear someone with such genius look back on their life. He reflects back and on his works and his life and so on. And so it's really interesting to hear him. For example, to hear him diagnose why he had a mental breakdown. I believe he was at the age of 20, I want to say, and he had this mental breakdown. And so 40 some years later, whenever it was, he wrote this autobiography. He looks back and sort of diagnoses why he thinks that was the case. More on that here in a moment. So really interesting guy. Highly recommend the autobiography. His dad was a really famous dude himself, James Mill, very prolific writer at the time, pretty well known at the time too. John Stuart Mill, and you hear him discuss this in the autobiography, endured a very grueling childhood education that was, facilitated by his father, demanded by his father, with good intentions. Again, his father was very studious, academic, a writer, professional writer, if you will. And so it's not, I guess, that surprising that he would demand kind of this very academic upbringing, but it was extremely, rigorous. And you hear, again, Mill reflecting back on that in the autobiography. So, for example, he was learning Greek at the age of 3. Most of us are still learning our original language. He had read 6 Platonic dialogues by the age of 8. How many of you guys have even read one? And some of these dialogues, for example, Plato's famous Republic is 300 plus pages. So these aren't just, 10-page dialogues. And they're extremely dense and at times and, notoriously difficult to parse and figure out. So, he's tackling these at the age of 8. And he was also tasked with being sort of the teacher of his younger siblings. So it was a pretty large family, and he was not only, tasked with learning himself, but then also putting together lesson plans for the younger kids as well. So a pretty tough upbringing in some sense, but in some ways it paid off. Not only for Mill, but for the rest of humanity. In the sense that we get to enjoy, everything that he's offered for us in terms of his philosophy. So clearly, he's got a philosophical mind. He's a pretty smart dude. And a lot of this, no doubt, is probably due to his upbringing and that educational upbringing, that academic upbringing that his father demanded. And so he thinks, it's interesting, he doesn't fault his father, and this comes out in the autobiography, he doesn't fault his father for the rigorous nature, and academic nature of his upbringing. What he sort of suggests was the problem was it left brain that's analytical? I always get this mixed up. So it's a left brain that's sort of supposed to be analytical and mathy and so on, and the right side supposed to be artsy and so. And I might have that flipped around, but you get the idea. He said his upbringing was entirely focused on logic and science and analysis and that sort of thing, and entirely neglected the emotional components of our nature, right? Which he thinks are arguably equally important. And so he thinks that was then the impetus for his sort of mental breakdown as he's going into the university. He's ill-equipped, he thinks, to deal with the emotions of everyday life, especially at that tumultuous time of our lives, late teens, early 20s. That's a pretty difficult period in our life. And so he thinks that was the reason. And so what does he do to pull himself out of this emotional turmoil? He reads romantic poetry, and eventually, the mental stupor doesn't last too long, and he's able to rescue himself by appealing to, poetry, which appeals to those emotions and that emotional aspect of his nature, which was up to that point neglected. Okay. And I think that's it. So I just, again, reiterate, very prolific writer, huge contributions, kind of like Aristotle, not just in 1 or 2 or 3 facets of philosophy, but in many, many different branches, including, as I mentioned, my specific area of expertise, if you will, or what I spent a great deal of time studying, the utility of religion, a very specific, aspect of philosophy. He wrote an entire essay on that. And not to, actually, there are a few different essays he'd written on that subject. So, very prolific writer. Why are we interested in him? Again, we're going to go back to this and this discussion, right? Which obviously has moral implications. This discussion, this issue we have, right? How much of our freedom to concede, if we acknowledge we have to forfeit some of our freedoms, we can't have that right to everything that Hobbes says we have in that state of nature. Well, how do we go about doing that? Okay, how do we go about discerning and figuring out and outlining when and where and how we can limit one another's freedom or our behavior. And again, that's what Mill is also interested in. So in general, he wants to know when are individuals, societies, and governments justified in intervening in the behavior of an individual, right? When is it permitted or required of individuals to submit to some sort of authority, right? To not do exactly what they want, right? When is that permissible? Okay, and how should we exactly go about doing that? As he says, and this is from, I believe it's on Liberty, and so it's not included in our textbook, regardless. He says, quote, what then is the rightful limit to the sovereignty of the individual over himself? At what point does he no longer have complete control over himself? You know, at what point can we come in or the state come in and say, you can't do that. You can't gamble away your money, or, you know, you can't stay up all night, right? Or you have to brush your teeth, right? At what point, in what circumstances, when is that okay? So this is, you know, obviously a very much related concept, okay, that we need to talk about then is this idea of paternalism. Okay? And I like the definition that the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy offers. It's very straightforward. By the way, a very highly useful source. Okay? Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Very helpful source if you want another perspective on any of these things. You can look it up, and they'll give you oftentimes a different way of looking at a concept. So basically, the way they define paternalism is, quote, paternalism is the interference of a state or an individual with another person against their will and defended or motivated by a claim that the person interfered with will be better off or protected from harm. Okay, so there's two important things to unpack here, right? There's two important ingredients, if you will, when it comes to paternalism. First of all, the interference, right? We're talking about interfering in someone's behavior, an individual's behavior. That interference is against their will, right? They don't want that interference. Okay, you're interfering and saying, little Billy, you need to brush your teeth and go to bed. They don't want to do it, right? It's against their will. And secondly, and equally important, right, otherwise you don't have paternalism, is the idea that it's for that person's own good. It's for little Billy's own good. Okay, you don't know anybody better, little Billy. That's why I have to step in, right? Some authority figure, step in, infringe on your freedom, and make you do what's actually in your best interest. Okay? That's the idea behind paternalism. Now, we want to note from the outset here, Mill's going to be very much on guard against paternalism, very, very leery of paternalism. Okay, and the reason for that, okay, is he wants to say, look, this is incredibly difficult to figure out, who gets to be the authority figure. Right? Now, it's easy when it comes to parents and kids, right? Arguably, everybody endorses some degree of paternalism, right? Especially when it comes to kids, right? They have to brush their teeth, they have to go to school, and so on and so forth. But where it gets really difficult is when you're dealing with, say, grown adults, right? Should the state be able to come in and say, you can't go and gamble your money at a neighborhood poker tournament? Should the state be able to say that? Or you can't engage in prostitution, or you can't smoke marijuana, right? Should the state be able to come in and say that? And presumably, right, for all three of those things I just mentioned, those are paternalistic measures on the part of the state, right? At least for the people that want to engage in those behaviors, right? It's against their will. And presumably, right, it's for their own benefit. Otherwise, why is the state stepping in and saying they can't do it, right? Presumably, it's for their own benefit, right? We engaging in prostitution is not ultimately going to be for your own benefit. Gambling leads to lots of problems, not in your own benefit, or so the state says. That's the argument, right? Same thing with marijuana, the classic argument of a gateway drug or something like that. Okay, so those are classic examples of paternalism applied not to children, but actually to adults. Right? And you can see then how it gets a little bit then dicey, right? Because those aren't, for most of us, right? Those aren't as clearly acceptable, at the very least, right? As requiring kids to brush their teeth, to go to bed at a certain time, and to go to school. So that's the sort of problem Mill has in mind, as we'll see. And so as I mentioned on slide 5 then, right, there's problems with paternalism, and this is what Mill's picking up on, right? We have to determine to what extent, right, and degree we're going to institute paternalism, at what times, who gets to be the parent. We all think we know the right way of doing things, but that's the problem, right? Because we conflict at times and we can't all be right, right? And the idea here is, in some sense, when you have paternalism being instituted, right, it's kind of like a parent-child relationship. The idea is one of the people or the state, for example, knows better, right? They're like the parent. They're the rational one. They know what's actually in the other person's best interest, right? And the other person doesn't know any better. They're like the child, the one that needs parenting, the one that's acting irrational otherwise. Well, who gets to be the parent, especially when it comes to adults, right? When you're leaving kids out of the mix, when you're talking about things like gambling, prostitution, drug prohibition, and so on. Who are the rational ones? Is there going to be any clear consensus regarding that? Probably not. And again, these are the kinds of things that Mill worries about. What's fairly restricted? Can it be anything that's for your best interest, or does it have to be a sort of extreme thing, right? Can we limit everything that you do that's not in your own interest, or again, does it have to be a very sort of extreme thing? I still do things that are arguably in my own interest, right? I stay up too late, right? Should my wife, she's always telling me you don't get enough sleep. Should she be able to just chain me up to the bed as soon as midnight strikes because it's in my own interest, even though I don't want it? Somebody that's extremely paternalistic might argue yes, okay? But again, Mill is going to be one who cautions us against this sort of paternalistic thinking. He's very much on guard against it. And flipping to slide 6 or turning to slide 6 or page 6, right? He emphasizes we must draw a line somewhere when it comes to this constant intervention and intervening in people's behavior, right? We have to be on guard against that, he says. So he says, again, this isn't included. I believe this is in On Liberty, one of his famous books. He says, quote, unless we are willing to adopt the logic of persecutors and to say that we may persecute others because we are right and that they must not persecute us because they are wrong, we must beware of admitting a principle of which we should resent as a gross injustice the application to ourselves. So he's saying, right, we wouldn't want people constantly coming to us and telling us, look, you don't really know what's in your own interest. We can't let you do that, right? You wouldn't like them constantly applying this sort of paternalistic method or thinking to you, right, in instances where it requires you then to not do what you want. So be careful then when you're insisting on doing the same thing to others. Right? That's what Mill is suggesting here. Okay, so turning to slide 7, alternatively, right, paternalism, if you think about it, is very much, emphasizing moving this way. Okay, we're submitting. If you justify paternalism, you're justifying the authority, right, the legitimacy, right, of submitting then to the authority figure, right, which is determining what you can and can't do then. If you, right, are endorsing paternalism. But on the other hand, Mill, right, is very much wary of it. Instead, he's a philosophical liberal, right, endorses philosophical liberalism, which is basically just an emphasis on the importance of freedom, our individual freedoms, right, retaining those, right. So he instead is going to be one who emphasizes, no. Let's focus on staying as far this way as we can. Granted, we don't want to be here. Still, let's focus on trying to retain, right, being the philosophical liberal he is, trying to retain as many of those individual rights and liberties as we can. Okay. So that's the impetus behind him saying, and again, this isn't included in our text. I believe this is from On Liberty, quote, in the conduct of human beings towards one another, it is necessary that general rules should for the most part be observed in order that people may know what they have to expect. That is, if you pay close attention there, right, that's him conceding that, look, we have to have some rules in place. We can't have a complete state of anarchy. We need to be able to know roughly what to expect from one another. We have to move this way a little bit, okay? But then immediately, right, but in each person's own concerns, his individual spontaneity is entitled to free exercise. All errors which he is likely to commit against advice and warning are far outweighed by the evil of allowing others to constrain him to what they deem his own good. Okay, so what he's saying is, look, even if, we're right to suggest look, Billy, you can't do that. You shouldn't do that. It's not in your own interest. Now imagine, especially, it's easier to appreciate this point if you imagine Billy is now grown up. You know, he's an adult. Okay, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that. Right. If we keep saying that sort of thing, he wants to say that constant restriction is far worse than, right, the instances where we're actually correct, that he is screwing himself over and doing what he's going to do, right? Even if we're correct, Mill's saying, right, and in those instances, he's doing something that jeopardizes his own interest. Us constantly interfering and meddling in his affairs is a far worse evil, Mill wants to say. Okay, so we're better off, his approach is, we're better off staying out of it, letting Billy, right, figure things out on his own. Okay, that granted, he might screw up and do something that undermines his own interest here and there. It's far better off, that situation is far better off than the alternative where people are constantly coming in and, you know, enslaving him more or less, right? Restricting his freedom to the point where he's constantly in shackles. That's Mill's opinion. Again, that we're better off erring this way, right? Not constantly interfering than we are the opposite, where we're constantly wanting to be paternalistic and constantly want to interfere with others, individuals' behaviors when it's against their own interest. Okay, well, Mill, you've given us a lot of reason to be cautious about restricting people's freedom, right? Well, when do you think it's legitimate then, right? You owe us some explanation of when it, in fact, is okay to restrict an individual's behavior. And that's where he then offers, and this will be a good point to erase this, I think, he offers his famous harm principle. So we're turning to slide or page 8 at this point. Excuse me. So let's just throw this up here. So this is him attempting to give us some guiding principle, right? Again, because we want to know when it is in fact justified to step in and limit an individual's behavior. And so he offers the harm principle. He says, and this is from 203 on the text in the textbook, quote, the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, that's, you know, friend to friend or the state, you know, meddling in the individual's behavior. The only time, the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, and interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number, is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Okay, to others, right? This isn't paternalistic. That's the end of quote, by the way. So again, that's from 203. This isn't paternalistic, right? The only time Mill says we ought to interfere with an individual's behavior is not when what they're going to do is undermine their own interests, but rather when what they're going to do is going to harm other people. Then and only then, he says, should we step in and say no. Remember, he wants to say, if all they're doing is harming themselves, we're far better off just letting them figure things out for themselves, right? It's a far greater evil to constantly interfere in those instances. But when they're going to harm others in doing whatever it is they're doing, okay, he wants to say, then step in and restrict what their behavior, their ability to do whatever it is they want to do. Okay, and also he points out, this is on 204, that this can be, you know, flipped around, right? You can not only be like restricted from doing something you want to do, right, if it's going to hurt others, but you can also be forced to do something you otherwise wouldn't have done, right? So imagine, I think this is a classic example in many philosophical hypothetical examples, but like somebody walking by and they see a baby face down in a big muddy puddle, right? Should they be compelled to step into the puddle, get their shoes wet, their brand new shoes, right? Get their shoes wet to save the baby, right? Well, let's imagine, right, that there's somebody out there that wouldn't go save the baby because they wanted to save their own shoes. Mill's saying, look, the same thing applies here. You can also compel someone to have to act, right, if by not acting they would have otherwise significantly harmed someone else, right? Obviously, the baby would die if the person didn't go into the puddle and save the baby, right? So in those instances, he's saying you can also force someone to do something that they otherwise wouldn't have wanted to do if it's going to harm someone else if they don't. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. He's talking about that on 204. That's where he says, quote, there are also many positive acts for the benefit of others, for example, saving a baby from otherwise drowning, which he may rightfully be compelled to perform, end quote. Hence, quote, a person may cause evil to others not only by his actions, but by his inaction, end quote. Okay, so that's just supporting that, look, in instances where there's going to be harm done to others, either through our action or our inaction, in both cases, we can be compelled to then act or don't act, right, depending on the situation. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, moving on to slide 9. So underlying this harm principle is obviously the distinction between acts or harms that are merely self-regarding, as he calls them, and those that are also other, terrible handwriting again, other regarding. Okay, what do we mean here? Right? He's saying, again, with the harm principle, the only time we're justified stepping in intervening in someone's behavior, either not letting them do something they want to do or making them do something they don't otherwise want to do, is if, right, their behavior or lack thereof is going to be other regarding, right? It's going to affect others. If they themselves are the only ones that are going to be negatively impacted, assuming there's some sort of harm, right? If they themselves are the only ones, right, it's merely self-regarding, then look, there's no, again, the point about it's a far greater evil to interfere constantly in these sorts of things. If that's what's going on and only that, you don't have the license to interfere, he wants to say, right? That's the idea behind the harm principle, okay? So again, he's arguing that we ought to let an individual do whatever they choose to do, even if we perceive their actions to be detrimental to themselves, so long as their actions are merely self-regarding. Now, he does mention some exceptions on the bottom, or on page 203, right? Children, they're not yet ready or rationally capable of figuring things out, right, in a sustained, healthy sort of way. He mentions others, the mentally handicapped, elderly, and so on. So there are these very few exceptions, right? Most notably children. Okay, but otherwise, this holds true, right? This applies, right? We ought to adhere to this harm principle. Another thing I really like about Mill, moving on to slide or page 10, that stands out, and one of the reasons why I really appreciate him as a philosopher is that his ability to acknowledge or appreciate, recognize, and acknowledge, and then address potential criticisms to his argument before they're even, advanced by the opposition. And so one clear example here, right, is he recognizes, well, hold on a second. Is this distinction really that clear cut? So take, for example, some classic examples that would seem on the face of them to be merely self-regarding. Suicide or a closet alcoholic, right? In other words, closet alcoholic, not one who's going out there driving all over, crashing into things, but somebody who's just drowning in the proverbial bottle in their closet, right? Not harming anyone else, presumably. And he wants to say, well, hold on, right? Or maybe his opposition would want to say, well, hold on, Mill, even in these seemingly merely self-regarding instances, do we really have cases where there's no harm done to others? So, for example, suicide. Fortunately, I've never known anyone myself, on a personal level, that's committed suicide, but I've known many people who have, and it's according to them, it's clearly, obviously, not merely self-regarding. Others are devastated, oftentimes when suicide happens. So, suicide on the face of it seems merely self-regarding. Well, no. Right, it seems to impact many people. Same thing with a closet alcoholic, if you think about it, right? I mean, if nothing else, this closet alcoholic could be contributing more to society. Maybe if he or she wasn't drowning in the bottle, they would discover a cure to cancer or something to that effect. But no, they're doing this other thing, right? So even that, where it seems like, oh, they're only harming themselves, they don't have a family, they're kids that they're harming or anything like that. Well, still, they could be contributing more to society. In that sense, even that, right, would be other regarding them. And he acknowledges this issue, right? He says, again, not included in our textbook, quote, the distinction here pointed out between the part of a person's life which concerns only himself and that which concerns others, many persons will refuse to admit. How, it may be asked, can any part of the conduct of a member of society be a matter of indifference to the other members? No person is an entirely isolated being. Okay? So it makes sense, and he's acknowledging that. So, look, he's trying to offer us something, though, right? He's trying to give us something to work with. We need to know, if we don't want a state of anarchy, we need to have some sort of guiding principle. And granted, there might be this issue associated with it, and he acknowledges it. And then he says, well, look, let me give you another principle to sort of help, right, clarify this one. And this is where we get his distinct and assignable obligations principle. So sorry about this mess here. So the distinct and assignable obligations principle. Now this is offered in an attempt to help clarify, right, given the sort of issue we just discussed, when we ought to construe a harm, right, it's something that's done that's harmful, as being merely self-regarding, and when we ought to construe it as being other-regarding. Okay, so that's why he's offering this principle. This will help distinguish, right, when to construe it as also being other-regarding. So he says, quote, when by conduct of this sort, in other words, conduct that's harmful, a person is led to violate a distinct and assignable obligation to any other person or persons, the case is taken out of the self-regarding class and becomes amenable to a moral disapprobation in the proper sense of the term. Right? So when we have a distinct and assignable obligation at the time, right, when we've done this harmful behavior, then we ought to construe it as not being merely self-regarding, but also other-regarding. So for example, let me give you an example. Let me start with the example Mill gives you, actually. So he, and that last quote and this example where he tries to give an example for applying this, this is it's close to where the passage is in our textbook, but not in the passage that is included in our textbook. So it's not included, is the point there. He says, though, quote, no person ought to be punished simply for being drunk, right? It's okay to be drunk. So like the closet alcoholic, right? But a soldier or policeman should be punished for being drunk on duty. So to help clarify, for example, the drunk situation. Look, we gotta figure this out, right? We have to treat each of these situations in some way, right? So unless they're, say, on duty, right, or let's say they have children that depend on them, right? If they're not on duty, right, they're not a police officer on duty at the time, they're not at work, right, or they don't have children that are depending on them at the moment, okay, then look, that closet alcoholic, right, getting drunk at that moment, that's merely self-regarding. But, right, if they have kids that are sitting there depending on them, that's a distinct and assignable obligation. Or if they're on duty as a police officer at the moment, or at any job most of the time, right, then that ought to be construed as other regarding. Another example that I like to use is going to the casino and blowing all your money. How should we treat that? Should we step in, right? We have a friend, a buddy that's, a gambling addict. Right? Should we step in and say, look, you got a problem. I can't let you go to the casino tonight. Depends, Mill wants to say. Again, is his behavior just harming himself or is it harming others? Well, I don't know, Mill. It's kind of fuzzy. Well, does he have a distinct and assignable obligation? And so he, you might think about things like, again, does he have a family at home? Is he blowing all this money and yet these children are depending on him? In that case, you should construe it as being other regarding. You should step in, right? But if on the other hand, he has nobody that's dependent on him, right, and no discernible distinct and assignable obligations at the time, then even though he's screwing himself over, blowing all his money, going into debt, you ought to let him go to this casino. Okay, that's the kind of thing that Mill's suggesting, and it can be tough accepting that, right? But again, remember his point. It's far worse if we're constantly meddling in everyone's behavior all the time. And then there's also the issue, if you're going to allow that sort of thing, well then who gets to be the one meddling, right? Because we all think we're right. So to avoid all those problems, Mill thinks this is the best way to proceed. Okay? So he wants to say, look, we got to proceed somehow, right? And here's the best I've got to offer, Mill wants to say. Okay, some general kind of thoughts, and then we'll end it here. Mill does say, first of all, we tend to be too paternalistic as it is. Now, go back and note, just to repeat what I said earlier, right? The harm principle, when we are justified in stepping in someone's behavior, it's never for their own good, right? It's never paternalistic in nature. Okay? It's always because what they're going to do is harm someone else, not them. Okay? So even when he does justify stepping in and limiting an individual's behavior, it's not on paternalistic grounds. Okay? And he has a lot of things to say, obviously, about paternalism, as we mentioned. He thinks that historically we've been far too paternalistic. He mentions, although this has arguably gotten better, right? But historically, the instance of religious intolerance throughout history has been, terrible, he would say. And in general, he says, quote, Again, this isn't in our actual text, in our textbook, but this is from Mill. Quote, "It is not difficult to show by abundant instances that to extend the bounds of what may be called moral police until it encroaches on the most unquestionably legitimate liberty of the individual is one of the most universal of all human propensities." In other words, there's constantly this tendency to go too far and intervene in individuals' behavior. We're doing it way too often, far too often. And not only that, he wants to say, look, society as it is already exerts significant pressure on individuals, right? On a, you might say, subconscious level, right? We're kind of tend to conform, right? Because we don't want to fight an uphill battle, right? If we don't conform, and we're the abnormal ones, right? No, we want to fit in, so to speak. Most of us, right, want to fit in, and so then we conform, right? And we sort of have to mold ourselves to all these other influences as it is, right? It's already too much as it is, Mill says, and so to then constantly then also try to justify all these paternalistic interventions, suggests that'd be going way too far. Then I also like his point, though, where he says, the upshot too, if you're constantly meddling in someone's affairs, again, that's a far greater evil. They're going to start just tuning you out. Even when you might have some really sage, great advice that will really help them, they're so sick of constantly hearing you, telling them what they're doing is they need to do something else, that they're just going to tune you out, even again when it really matters, right? So that's a problem. And I can sort of speak to that. I really like this lecture, this subject, because as a parent, it's something I've really struggled with as a parent. Many of you maybe are parents yourself. You struggle with this sort of when to step in and how much to step in, and when not to. And when you constantly are saying, stop doing this, I do notice, that they kind of do start to tune you out a little bit. And so there's something to that. And also, if you're constantly stepping in and making people act and behave a certain way, Mill suggests that's going to stifle creativity and change, right? Pretty soon, everybody's going to act and behave the exact same way. Do we want that? Mill famously suggests no. We want to promote experiments in living, letting people live in different, interesting ways, right? Provided they're not hurting other people. Okay, so that's a famous expression, experiments in living. Why not let people live the way they want to live? Okay, provided they're not going to harm you in doing so. Okay, so moving on to then slide 13. The last sort of thing I guess I would have to say then is reflecting back on the idea of social contract, right? So there's actually parallels between some of the things Mill says and what the social contract theorists like Hobbes and Locke suggest. But Mill doesn't like this idea of there actually being a contract. So look, they both think political authority is legitimized by the sense of security, right? Protection that the government, solicits for the people that are governed. Okay? And that's similar to what the social contract theorists think is going on, right? The sovereign is offering security for those that are governed. Okay? But he suggests, quote, no good purpose is answered by inventing a contract in order to deduce social obligations from it, end quote. So a lot of what so Mill speaking here, right? A lot of what those social contract theorists suggest, about the point and purpose and objective of government is correct. But why, create this idea, this fanciful idea of there being some sort of contract? No, we don't need that idea of contract. Otherwise, though, some of the other stuff they said, he seems to be on board with. Okay. What ultimately for Mill, and this goes back to his utilitarianism, which we will then pick up on, in probably about 3 lectures. I can't remember exactly. I think it's lecture 8 or 9. When we talk about his utilitarianism, right? What ultimately legitimizes any government for Mill is going to be, again, happiness in general, the utility, right? Utilitarianism. Utility is a fancy word for happiness. The utility the government promotes. And obviously that's going to be dependent in large part on the security that it offers, right? As he says on 204 of our reading, quote, I regard utility, and again, that's a fancy word for happiness, as the ultimate appeal on all ethical questions, end quote. So that's going to decide, right? Utility is also going to decide then, right, the legitimacy of any government. Okay? Is it promoting happiness or utility for the people that are being governed? If it does, then it's a legitimate government. Otherwise, if it doesn't, right, we ought to be raising questions, Mill's suggesting. Okay, so with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up. I mentioned how, I really look forward to this lecture because it really hits home. I mean, I grew up in a really strict environment with what I thought were strict parents. I mentioned, I think, in the introduction before the lectures, right? The very first video, that when I graduated high school, I wanted to get far away from Kearney, from my hometown, and that's because I feel like I grew up, with very strict, overbearing parents, and so I always told myself, well, I'll come into it and be the opposite, right? I'll be flexible and let my kids, kind of choose their own path. Well, that's easy to say, right? It all comes full circle, because when I'm letting, my son watch Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles at age 5 or 6, and then get a call right from the school saying he's acting out on the playground, you kind of do have to step in, right, a little bit more than maybe you want, and then kind of start to think, well, maybe mom and dad, maybe they weren't so off, and censoring me as much as they did. Maybe it wasn't being strict per se, but just being paternalistic and looking out for my own interests. So it's something that I struggle a lot with. I really look forward to the discussions that we have if we were teaching this, if I was teaching this face to face, but really look forward to the posts too in response to these questions. And that, should the adults be forced to attend college question on the first one, assume for the sake of argument, right, that going to college is in everyone's best interest. I know that there is no such argument, right? But assume for the sake of this question, right, that it is in everyone's best interest. Then should we be compelling adults to go to college? That's the same line of thinking for kids, right? It's in their own interest. That's why we make them go to elementary school. Well, why don't we apply the same thing to adults? Is it just this magic number of 18? Is that the only difference? And what about, I really like these, questions related to censorship. How do you go about that? Maybe somebody out there has that parenting manual, because I'm still looking for it. I don't know the proper degree of censorship to institute when it comes to parenting. So these are all related issues, right? The Mill has a lot to say about, that I find fascinating and interesting to discuss. So look forward to our discussion posts. Hopefully you enjoyed the lecture. Stay tuned for the next lecture, which is on Epicurus and hedonism. Thanks.